Today will be a basic introduction to hand embroidery. I'll talk about choosing fabric, the different kinds of needles and floss, and show you a few stitches to get yourself started. I'll go over some other handy tools to have and some resources that you might find helpful once this class is over. So first, let's get ourselves started off with a brief history lesson. Examples of fabric decorated with thread have been found worldwide and as far back as ancient Egypt. Embroidery has been especially prevalent in Middle Eastern and Asian cultures, then coming to Europe a little later. But these are just some examples of embroidery. And like I said, it can be found all over the world for, as long as we've been making art. Historically, embroidery was a way of embellishing garments and other textiles and was often seen as feminized work. Later on, as embroidery became much more of a displayed art form, we can see it as sort of a form of biography for women, especially marginalized women at the time, who stitched things that were important to them and around them. These are some examples of historical embroidery, including probably the most well-known specific example, the Bayeux tapestry, which is an embroidery. It's not actually a tapestry. So in the last few decades, embroidery has made a resurgence and is now a really popular hobby, with some people even able to make a living off of their works. It's shifted to more of a, displayed art form as opposed to mostly clothing decorations, although it is still very much alive as a folk art. More often these days, you will see it displayed in the hoop or as hanging works, and there are so many more experimental styles and such a wide variety of types of work out there. It's a really great way to kind of de-stress and step away from screens. And it's very much kind of a free-for-all type of art. So I'm going to switch over my camera now. Okay. Oops. Sorry, everybody. Just need to fix my screen here. Perfect. Okay. So hand embroidery has a few basic tools. One of them is your hoops. So hoops come in many shapes, sizes, and materials, and they're very important to keep your fabric taut while you are working on it. Typically, it is made of 2 rings, an inner hoop and an outer hoop that will have hardware on it. Most you'll have seen come as wood, or this one here is bamboo. There are also a type called Q-snaps, which are plastic and they just snap in place. This here is typically called a flexi hoop. So it's got a hard plastic ring and a flexible rubber or silicone outer ring. You are also able to buy floor stands or desk stands that can hold your hoop in place so that you can have both hands. The other really important thing you need is fabric. For the most part, sky's the limit. If you can get a needle and thread through it, you can embroider it. So mostly you're going to be working with cotton, most likely quilter's cotton. But you can also find linen, canvas. I quite like working on denim. You can even use lace and silk, and even, cardstock, wood, paper, vinyl, leather. yeah, again, if you can get a needle through it, you can embroider it. When it comes to choosing fabric, you do kind of want to avoid stretchy fabrics like any jersey or knit fabrics, unless you're going to be using a stabilizer. Usually you can work with just one piece of fabric. I like to double up and use a second piece underneath. You can reserve this just for when you're working with very thin or very light colored fabrics, but I like using a second piece to kind of help stabilize my work. The next really important tool that you need is floss. And just like with fabric and hoops, there's lots of types to choose from. So you might have seen the words embroidery thread before, but the proper term is floss. Embroidery floss is made up of 6 strands of cotton that can be split. So right here, I have some typical embroidery floss, and you can see I can split it up. You can see it's made up of 6 different strands that you can then pull apart and use, as many or as little strands as you like when you're doing your work. DMC and Anchor are very popular brands. This one I have here is DMC. Metallic floss here is made up of polyester or a polyester blend. And I'll be honest, it's really pretty, but it can be difficult to work with. So just like with the regular floss, you can see the metallic floss here is also strands. So again, you can kind of pull it apart and use as many or as little or as few strands as you like. So be aware that not all colors, types, or brands will be color fast. So what that means is when it gets wet, it shouldn't bleed. So the dye shouldn't run. Mostly this is going to be an issue if you have inherited any older floss that might have been made several decades ago. It shouldn't be a problem with brand new stuff. But if you're going to be embroidering onto something that will go through the wash, I would snip off a little piece and run it under some water to test first, just to ensure that it is indeed color fast. This here is cotton pearl, and this floss, it is not stranded. It's one piece of thread, and it comes in various thicknesses. So this one here, this is DMC, and you can see it's a 5. And let me just find an end piece here. So it's just one strand, so it won't separate, and you can get them in various thicknesses. You can also use ribbon, wool, yarn. If you can get it through a needle, and then you can get that needle through thread, you can make art with it. So speaking of needles, needles are also super important. Embroidery or crewel needles are sized 1 to 10, with 1 having the largest eye and 10 being the smallest eye. If you're new to embroidery, I suggest that you get a variety pack. So this one here, you can see they're all roughly the same length, but you can kind of see that this one in the middle has a very large eye, and then the one at the end here has a very, very tiny eye. You can maybe get 1 strand through that. So yes, if you're new to embroidery, I suggest that you get a variety pack just to kind of figure out what you like working with best. Maybe you like the handle of, shorter needles, longer needles, whatever works best for you and your abilities. So thicker needles will leave thicker holes, but that's not going to be the biggest deal unless you're working with something like leather or vinyl, where once you make a hole, it stays there, it's stuck. You can also get what are called chenille needles. They're a bit longer with bigger eyes, and they're usually used for thick threads or ribbon. I personally like to use milliner's needles. So these are the needles that I personally like to use. And milliner's needles are usually longer. See, these are quite long. They're very sharp, and they're the same size all along. So I'll just pull this one out. So you can see this one here. It's going to be the same size along the shaft and to the eye. So milliner's needles are particularly good for doing knots with. But again, get a mixed pack, play around with them, see what feels and works best for you. When you're doing embroidery, you also need scissors. So in an ideal world, you will have large fabric shears that are just for cutting fabric, and you'll use those to cut your material. And then you will want some smaller scissors. These are just some that I have. And these little ones are for snipping floss. So these ones here, they're pretty small, but they kind of get the job done. These ones here are a older pair. They're very nice. And these ones in particular here are also a little magnetic. So my needle sticks. Just something I really like having handy. All right, so these are the basic tools that you need. Like I said earlier, you really don't need anything fancy to get yourself going and get yourself started. But of course, you know, there are some other tools that can come in handy. So I want to show you, this here is thread gloss or thread wax, and this is vital for if you're going to be using metallic thread. So it's just some wax on the inside. This one smells like lemons. And what you can do with this, when you've got some metallic thread, because metallic thread is a polyester blend, it's pretty rough. It's really easy to fray. It's really easy to snag. And so when you have some metallic floss, you can just run it through the wax, and you can kind of see a little bit. And basically what this does is it puts a seal on your floss. It, you know, makes it a little bit harder for it to, you know, fray. So this wax in particular is from a company called So Fine. You can buy it online, or you can also find it in some more trendier craft or fabric stores. But I've got this one. They come in a lot of different scents. This one's lemon, it's very nice. Some other things that you can use to make your time a little easier is some needle minders for keeping your needle handy. I've got this one here. So needle minders are little magnets, and I'll show you on here. So they've got a big part and a little backing. So you just put your little backing on there, and it will stick together, and it will keep your needle from going amok. You can always just kind of tuck it in there, but this can be a little cuter. Let's be real here. You can also usually have some tweezers on hand for picking out any little fluffies or anything like that. I also recommend having a stitch ripper. This is a really old one and a pretty big one. So stitch rippers are good for, maybe you've made a mistake or you've, done a bit of stitching and you figure this isn't the right stitch I want to use. This isn't the right color I want. So you can use your stitch ripper to go in and just cut away any of those stitches you've already made and then pull them out with your tweezers. You might also want to invest in a thimble, either a metal or a silicone one. Pin cushions are also a good idea, same with needle threaders. I like to keep a little piece of sandpaper on me. Needles aren't always going to be as sharp as when you buy them. So I like to keep a piece of sandpaper on hand to get in front of the camera here to run my needle across. And it kind of helps resharpen my needle. Makes it nice and sharp again. And another thing that I have found helpful is to have a little piece of Velcro on hand. So this is just the hook part. And what this is really nice for is conditioning your floss. So when you're getting ready, I like to just run it through the Velcro a few times. And it can help you separate your floss. It's also good for detangling and getting out any little fluffies or any little rips. I can see we have a question in the chat here about the sandpaper. I don't run it in any particular direction. I usually run it with the eye out. And then I just kind of twist it around so that I can get all sides. And again, this isn't something you absolutely need to do. It's just something that I have found helpful and useful. Okay, so now that we've gone through our tools, we can start getting our piece ready to be stitched. So we're going to get together our hoop. We're going to get out some fabric, some floss, and I have a needle, and I'll use my cute little purple scissors. And I'm also going to get out a pattern. So when you are cutting your fabric should ideally be ironed, and it should be about 1.5 to 2 inches bigger than your hoop, because you'll need it to have some edges around to pull taut. If you are wanting to freehand your piece, you can skip these next few steps, but if you are going to be using a pattern, there's a couple steps you can take. So you can always create your own pattern, or you can find one. I'll show you. This is the book we're going to be doing the book giveaway for at the end of the program. So I'll open it up, and inside here, it's full of patterns. You can see, oops, got some roller skates here. There's some pretty birds. So you can always, there's lots of places to find and buy patterns. And I'll share some of those books and websites in a follow-up email. If what you are making is for yourself or a friend, you can use whatever you want, basically. If you are wanting to sell something you make with a pattern, you need to be aware of copyright and usage terms. So if you're buying a pattern, and you're going to want to sell it or sell what you make with it, you need to check with the pattern maker first. Some have no problem with people selling what they make with their patterns. Others will require you to apply for a licensing, apply for a licensing agreement. Others will have what is called an angel policy, which is specific rules on how a pattern can be used. So if your goal is to sell what you make, just do your due diligence and your research. Just make sure that when you are using a pattern, you've taken a look and you have found that it is okay to sell what you make with that pattern. So once you have a pattern, you need to put it on our fabric. And there are lots of different ways to do this. I suggest you try a few out and see what works for you. There are definitely some ways that I don't even want to bother with, and other ways that I have found very helpful. So one of the first ways you can try out is called the light tracing transfer method. And this is done by using a window, a lamp, or a light box, any source of light. You place the pattern between the light source and the fabric, and you just trace over it with a water-soluble pen. It's best to do when the fabric is already in the hoop, as the fabric will be taut and the pattern won't warp. You can also use iron-on patterns. So all the patterns in the book today for the book giveaway are iron-ons, meaning you can cut them and iron them right on. So if you are going to be making your own iron-on patterns, you will need what is called a heat transfer pen. So I've got two here. This one is from Sulky. It's a bit thicker. And I've also got one here from Sublime Stitching, which is a fine tip marker, so you can make really thin lines. So using your heat transfer pen, you can draw your pattern onto special paper called vellum paper. So vellum paper, it's pretty heavyweight. So it basically acts like tracing paper, but is safe to iron. So with your vellum paper and your heat transfer pen, I'm going to use this nice little strawberry here. Going to place our vellum paper on top, and using a heat transfer pen, you can very quickly trace over your pattern. Do a couple nice little dots for the seeds, and there you go. You've got something ready to iron on. Your next step is to just take your fabric, place your vellum paper pattern side down, and iron over. And the heat will transfer your pattern onto your fabric. There's two very important things you need to remember when using iron-on transfers. One, it won't come off. Once you get that pattern transferred onto your fabric, it's stuck there. No amount of washing or erasing is going to get that off. The other thing to keep in mind is if you are doing anything like text or anything that needs to face a certain way, you would need to remember to draw your pattern on backwards. I have made that mistake several times. So you can see here, I've written hi, but then when we make it face down, oops, it's backwards. So if you're creating your own iron-on transfer patterns, you need to remember to do it backwards so that when you iron it on, it will go the right way. Boop, boop, boop. Another thing that you can use is called graphite or transfer paper. So it looks like this. So on one side here, you've got the, I don't even know what to call this, but I guess it's just very compact powder, essentially. And what you can do with this, it usually comes in black, but you can also find it in white to use on darker colored fabric. So when you are using, let me flip this over. So when you are using graphite or transfer paper, what you want to do, I've just got my pattern here on some tracing paper. I've just got a little daisy. And so you want to put your transfer paper down, and then you want to put your pattern on top, and then either using a stylus or a pen, just going to use this pen here, you just trace over top of your pattern. This isn't a very good pen. You just trace over top, trying your very best to keep your pattern still. I should have brought a better pen. Oh, yeah, see, that didn't work very well. Let's try that with the other side of my needle here. So what should happen, good thing I just picked a little one. Okay. So that's not working out too well, but you can kind of see a bit of transfer has happened. I should have brought a better pen. So when you are using transfer paper, once you get it onto your fabric, there is some wiggle room when it comes to erasing. I like to use like one of those Tide to go pens, and those are usually pretty helpful. You can find transfer paper at almost any art supply store. So this type that I have here, I just found at a craft store on Main Street. They sell them in really big sheets at Opus. You can also buy them online. They also sell them at Michael's. So yeah, I highly recommend Opus because you can get them in big sheets, and they also sell them in the black and in the white. Also, at the end of the day, you can just use a pen. You can just draw straight onto your fabric and it's no problem at all. That's one of the things I love most about embroidery is you genuinely don't need anything special to do any of this with. Just a few simple tools and you're good to go. Oh, and I almost forgot, stabilizer. So stabilizer, for anyone who machine sews, probably knows it best for using in garment making, so particularly in like shirt collars. So stabilizer is a great thing that you can use to just add a bit more stability to your work. But you can also buy iron-on or soluble or tear-away stabilizer. And again, test stuff out and see what works best for you. What I have here that I already have a pattern drawn on, this is self-adhesive soluble stabilizer. So it will stick on. And when I'm done sewing my piece, I run it under water and it melts away. So this particular one here, it's just got, you peel it away and it's got a sticky side to it that you put right on your fabric, and then you just wash it right off afterwards. Okay. So we've got our fabric, we've picked a pattern. Now we want to get our fabric into our hoop. Getting fabric in a hoop can sometimes be a bit frustrating, but it is a necessary step. Oh, yes, I see a question in the chat box. So this particular stabilizer that I'm using is by Solvy, and it is called, I think, just Sticky Solvy. And yes, so stabilizer is very similar to interfacing. Thank you for your question. Yes. Yeah, so this is Solvy brand Sticky Solvy. If you just Google self-adhesive soluble interfacing, I can include it in our follow-up email for sure, because I've used it a few times now, and it is definitely a new preferred method of pattern transfer for me. So yeah, I can add that into our follow-up email for you for sure. Yes, Solvy, Solvy. Okay, where was I? Yes. Okay, so yeah, getting your fabric in the hoop can be a bit frustrating, but it is a necessary step. So what you want to do is you want to loosen the hardware and separate your hoops, or sorry, your two rings of your hoop. You want to place the inner ring down flat, and we're going to place our fabric over top. Next, we're going to take our outer ring and place it over top. This can be a little tricky. There we go. Get up. And then just kind of make sure everything is stable and fitting in. And then you can start to retighten your hardware. Don't tighten it all the way just yet, because you will want to go around and pull at your fabric just to make sure everything is nice and taut. There's no lines, there's no wrinkles, nothing is slipping. And then once you feel everything is good, you can go ahead and tighten your screw all the way. If you've got a lot of excess fabric around the edges, you can go ahead and trim a bit of that, but you will want to leave a bit of length at the end. So about this much is good, about 1/2 inch to 1 inch is pretty good. And we'll talk more about finishing hoops and what you can do with this excess fabric at the end of the program today. So, and then I'm going to put I'm actually going to stitch this one. So I'm going to put my pattern, I'm going to take it off there, and I'm going to put my Sticky Solvy right on, flatten that out, and boom. We're just about ready to get stitched in here. So our next step to getting thready is to separate our floss and thread our needle. So today I'm going to use this nice pink DMC thread. It's very bright, and I very much like very bright colors. One thing I forgot to note at the beginning is all floss comes with a number. So this one here is number 894. And that is very helpful for if you run out, but you still have some stitching that needs to get done. You can go to the store and find the exact color you need right away, instead of, and I've certainly done this before, holding up little pieces of floss next to other full ones and trying to match it as best as you can. So try your best to always keep your little, the little number there. So if you're using standard floss like we are today, you want to decide how many strands you want to use. So more strands equals thicker lines and so forth. So we're going to cut a length of floss. Perfect. If you're using metallic thread, this is when you would run it through the thread wax. You also don't want to have too long a piece of floss you're working with to avoid twisting and tangles. So I think today we're going to use 4 strands. That's typically the amount I use. I usually use between 2 and 4 strands. So I'm going to get my Velcro back out, and I'm just going to run this through a few times. You can maybe be able to see there's some tangles in there. Okay. And I'm going to separate out, I want 4 strands tonight. Perfect. I'm gonna just run through. Sometimes it can be a little difficult. That's okay. Perfect. So I'm going to set aside these 2 extra strands that I'm not going to use right now. I can always use those later on. So here we have the 4 strands we're going to work with tonight. I'm going to tie a knot at one end. It is perfectly acceptable to tie a knot. You can always, do different anchoring methods like weaving the ends in later. You can decide on doing no knot, but a knot is perfectly fine. I'm going to get my needle here. And this one's got a pretty big eye. I like working with bigger eyed needles. Pop that through and boom. We've got our, oops. Perfect, more or less. So now we've gone through all of these steps and we're finally on to the fun part, actually stitching. So there are literally hundreds of stitches and often multiple ways of creating a specific type of stitch. There are lots of step-by-step guides online that walk through, how to do many of these stitches. When it comes to actually stitching, just do what feels right and have fun. Your stitches don't need to be perfect. They don't need to be done a certain way. They just need to look nice to you and for you to have fun creating them. So today we're going to go over how to create a few common stitches. Backstitch, split stitch, and a particular favorite of mine, French knots. If we have some time later, we might be able to go through a few more, but we'll start with those 3. So the first one we're going to go with today is backstitch. So I made this earlier. I've got this little sampler here so we can see what they look like. So these ones here were done with 2 strands. So you can see what a thinner line or a thinner knot look like. So this one up here, we're going to start with our backstitch. tried and true, backstitch is probably the stitch you are going to use the most. It is definitely the one that I use the most. So going to take our needle and floss, and underneath, we're going to start at the very beginning of our line and bring our needle up and all the way through. You always got to make sure that your floss goes all the way through. Sometimes it will get stuck. So to finish off your stitch, you're going to want to bring your needle down a little bit away from where you brought your needle up. And you're just going to push your needle through. Again, come all the way out. There we go. We've just made a single stitch. So to make it be backstitch, you're going to be working essentially backwards. So when you go to make your second stitch, instead of coming up where you ended, you're going to want to come up a little bit away from where you ended your first stitch. So bring that up and through. And then to finish, let's get that out of the way. You're going to bring your needle back down where you finished your first stitch so that they will be connected. Again, push your needle through. And there we go. We've got a start to a line. And then you just keep working like this all the way along, bringing it up a little far away and bringing it back down where you've met your last stitch. I'm doing this upside down, so it's not going to be the neatest thing in the world. But you just keep going along until you've got a line. So one of the biggest pros about this stitch is it's really easy. And once you get the hang of it, you can go pretty fast. One of the cons of it, however, is that it does use up a lot of floss. I can show you on the other side here, because you're working backwards, you're doubling up a lot. So it does use up a lot of floss, but on the front side, it's pretty neat. You can usually go pretty quickly and get a line done. Easy peasy. There we go. Again, I'm doing this upside down, so it is a little crooked, but embroidery doesn't have to be perfect. All your stitches don't need to be the exact same length. It's perfectly lovely. So we've got a nice little line. And when you're done, you can just tie another knot there. And snip it off. Here we go. So you can kind of see the difference in thickness. The green here is using 2 strands and the pink is with 4. So you can definitely tell a bit of a difference there in thickness. If you were using all 6 strands, it would be even bigger and so forth. So the next one I'm going to show you here is split stitch. So split stitch is a little tricky, and there are a couple different ways of doing it. I'm going to show you the way that I do it, and then you are more than free to look up how other people do this particular stitch. I'll admit the way that I do it is kind of the trickier way, but it's the way I learned and it's just what works for me. So for this one, we're going to start off very similar to backstitch. So we're going to bring our needle and floss up at the very beginning of our line and going to again bring it back down a little farther away. Pull it right through. So now we've created, our single stitch again. But instead of coming up back on your line, you're going to bring your needle up through your previous stitch to split the floss. So for this one, you're always going to want to use an even number of strands, so 2, 4, 6, to get that even looking split, but it's not super necessary. So I'm going to just tilt this so it's a little easier for me to do. So going to take our needle and we're going to come up in between our stitch. So we've come up through. We're going to go all the way up and back out. And then we're going to bring our needle back down a little ways away. Go. So yeah, let me just see if I can get a little closer. So on the green line here, you can see it's got kind of a bit of a braided look almost. So on the pink here, there we go, that's a little easier. See if I can do it this way. Okay, so we've made our stitch and we're going to bring our needle. And this is the kind of tricky part. Up in through. Oops. Let's get that a little nicer. Up in through so that you're splitting the stitch. And then you want to bring it back down. Through your line. Oops. It's getting a little tangled there. Yeah, so this one, definitely not the easiest stitch. Once you get the hang of it, it does look very nice. So we'll bring that back up in through our previous stitch, out, and back down again. So it is a very pretty stitch, and the guts or the behind are very neat. Again, this is depending on how you do this stitch. There are other ways. It can be a very time-consuming stitch. It's not, the easiest thing to do. And so it can be time-consuming. It's not great at very tight corners or curves, but it does look very nice. It gives a lot of texture to a stitch. So if you are, using like big, thick lines, it looks really nice. This is another stitch that I use a lot. And because it's so time consuming, I'm not going to do the whole line. We'll just do one more here. Come up through the middle, pull through, and bring it back down. Whee! Yeah, so that's split stitch. I'm just going to get some more floss here. And the next one I'm going to show you is called a French knot. So it's not so much a stitch as it is, well, a knot. They're technically a decorative stitch that can be a little tricky, but once you get the hang of them, they can be quite fun. I personally really enjoy doing French knots. I think they're very cute. They are kind of harder on your wrist because you are twisting, but they're pretty cute. All right, so this one's a little different. Longer needles work best for this stitch, but aren't necessary. In this line here that I've done beforehand, this was using 2 strands, but alternating 1 and 2 wraps. So the more strands of floss you use and the more times you wrap it around your needle, the bigger your knot is going to be. So this little one here at the beginning is 2 strands wrapped once. This one here is 2 strands wrapped twice. So you can see, even though I've used the same amount of strands, you know, wrapping it that extra time can really change the size. So for this one, again, we're going to, actually, I'm going to move a little bit more into the center to give myself a bit of space. So we'll bring our needle up where we want our little knot to be. With one hand, you're going to hold the thread away from the point and keep it taut. With your other hand, you are going to bring your needle over and wrap the thread around it. So I think I can kind of do this. We're going to take our needle. We're going to, oops, this is a little tricky. We're going to wrap it under once. So we've just got that one wrap around. And with this other hand, you're still going to be holding your floss tight. And you're going to then insert your needle as close to the point where you came up as you can. You do not want to go back through the same point, but you want to go as close as you can. You're going to put your needle back down. And so at this point, you can see how big the knot is going to be. And this is also a really easy time to kind of pull away and maybe, you know, wrap twice or get some more or add on additional strands if the knot isn't going to be as big as you want it to be. So again, oops, put it as close as you can to the original spot and kind of pull down. Then with the hand holding the needle, you'll want to start pushing it through. Again, with your other hand still holding taut. And start slowly pulling through. And then once it gets kind of close, you can let go and pull through. Okay, so there, we've done a nice little knot. So that's 4 strands with 1 wrap. You can certainly do more. So let's do that again with 2 wraps. So we'll want to, again, bring our needle up at our point where we want our knot. Pull it tight. With one hand, we want to hold the floss taut, and we're going to wrap once, twice, Oops. 2 times. Put our needle back down as close as we can get without going through where our needle came up. Push through. And then, so you can definitely see a size difference here between 1 wrap and 2. When making French knots, I personally wouldn't do more than 3 wraps. I think at that point you want to maybe use a bead instead, because once you start doing several knots, what you get is called a bullion knot, and that looks very different. So I would say aim to not do more than 2 wraps. Definitely don't do more than 3. At that point, increase the number of strands you're using, or maybe think about using a bead, or getting some thick cotton pearl, or even using some yarn or a ribbon to get a bigger knot. So do that one more time. So again, through. We'll wrap this one 2 times. Back down. Through. And boom. We go. So yeah, French knots, they're tricky. They're not the easiest thing in the world to do, but I really like them and I think they're pretty cute. I've gotten quite quick at them. Once you get used to doing these ones, you can go pretty fast. Yes, they're not the easiest thing to do, but they're cute and they're fun. So, as I previously said, there are so many stitches out there that fit every kind of various look and style. There are stitch dictionaries and lots of online tutorials on different stitches. So go experiment and see what you like. Some other common stitches I can show you. So these are what are called line stitches because you just make a line with them. So you can see up top here, we have our backstitch and our split stitch. I can kind of get a little closer in there, other way. So yeah, backstitch is just really simple and easy line. The split stitch, it looks kind of braided and it definitely adds some character and texture to a stitch. This green one here is called running stitch and it resembles a dashed line. Very easy. It's just in and out, pretty quick. And this bottom one we have here in the blue, this is called stem stitch. And it's called that because it looks kind of like a vine. When I was about 6, 7 years old, my grandmother taught me how to embroider. And the only stitch she taught me was stem stitch. So for a very long time, all I knew and all I worked with was stem stitch. Now I rarely use it. I don't particularly like doing this one, but it looks really nice on curved lines because it's got that kind of diagonal piece to it. So there are definitely some great uses, and I know some people who just love doing stem stitch. Then we have some fill-in stitches here. So this one here is called satin stitch. For anybody who, embroiders regularly, I can almost guarantee that you will develop opinions and feelings about stitches. I firmly believe that everyone out there who does this regularly has at least one stitch that they just despise. Mine is satin stitch. So satin stitch is made up of just straight lines right next to each other and is used to completely fill in a space. It can look really nice or it can look really bad. This bottom one here we have is long and short stitch. It's also known as brick stitch because it kind of resembles bricks on a wall. So like satin stitch, it's also used to completely fill in a space, but this one is consisted of long and short stitches. So you can kind of see, yeah, there's just that mix of long and small stitches to completely fill in a space. This is the first time I had ever done long and short stitch. So you can kind of see some gaps in there. But again, embroidery doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to look pretty. I tried my very best, and that's all anyone can ask for. So this third one here is a little bit different. So this one is called seed stitch. And it is made up of stitches of various lengths and directions to partially fill in a space. So it gets its name from, if you were to throw just a bunch of random seeds on the ground, you'd kind of get that, varied look. So it's nice for if you mostly want to fill in a space, but maybe don't want to completely fill it in, like with these other two stitches here. And we also have some decorative stitches. So the top here is our good friend French knot. So these two here are 2 strands, 1 wrap, 2 wrap. Then we have 3 strands, 1 wrap, 2 wrap, 4 strands, 5 strands, and then finally 6 strands with 1 wrap and 2 wrap. So yeah, you can make, various sized French knots. They can all look very nice. This one we have below, this is called chain stitch, and it is called so because it resembles, a link of chain. It is made up of loops to make a kind of line. This one, again, there are several ways to do it. So if you try out one way and it doesn't really work for you, there is another way that you can make your chain stitch. And down here, this is called detached chain stitch. And so it is made by doing just a single one of these chain stitch loops. This is also very commonly referred to as a lazy daisy because it's really easy and you get a nice cute little flower out of it. And this one over here, this is called web or woven stitch, and it's been used a lot these days to make little rosettes. And so how you make this stitch, let me just find my don't know where I put my here's my tracing paper. So basically, to make web stitch, you make kind of a star, just very loose single stitches, and then using floss you weave, alternating going above and below each stitch to get this kind of rosette pattern. They're very nice. And this is also the first time I had ever done web or woven stitch, and I think it turned out pretty okay. So again, there are so many different types of stitches out there to create, different types of effects. and take a look at what's out there, see what works for you, see what looks right, and have fun. So once we've gone through and we've stitched our piece, we are left with the decision on how to display our work. And there's lots of different ways. So in the hoop is nice and easy. You can see, I like displaying it just in the hoop. That's very nice for me. You can either cut the ends completely. You can also, what I do is I glue, you can kind of see, let me just pull this away a bit. So I glue the ends down. So I glue them into the inner hoop ring. And then I cut a piece of felt that just goes over top, and it hides the quote unquote guts of your stitches. If you are using a wood or a bamboo hoop, they're usually pretty easy to paint. This is just acrylic paint. You can also get wood stain to stain your hoop a darker or like a nice like cherry wood is nice. But wood stains work really well on wood or bamboo. Not so much the bamboo hoops I have found, but wood hoops are good for staining. Some people just use running stitch along the edges and then tighten and cinch it in. You can also cut out, cardstock circles and just glue them right on the back. You can also get nice round pieces of wood cut. There are so many different ways to glue and display and finish up your hoop. I see a question in the chat. I just use hot glue. You can also use fabric glue, works just as well, or Gorilla Glue, but I just go with my good old hot glue gun. It can kind of burn your fingers a little bit when you're tucking them in, but it works just as well for me. If you decide that you don't want to display your work in the hoop, it's also super easy to take it out and staple it onto canvas or stretch it into a frame, put some rope or ribbon around and turn it into a wall hanging. Again, try out different things and see what feels good for you. Okay, so I'm going to just turn my camera off here now. So that's kind of the end of our content here. There are a couple other things that I would like to share with you before we go for tonight. First, let's get a look at these questions in our Q&A. Okay, so we've got some questions in here. So our first question, if your fabric is already in the hoop, how do you get the light source directly behind the fabric? So I don't personally use the light transfer method, but what you want to do, and this, I will admit, this only works with very light colored fabric, so white, beige, and anything particularly thin, because you want to hold it up in between you and the light source so that you can see it through the fabric. So it also doesn't work if you double up your fabric. And you kind of just hold it up like against your light source and then trace on. It's definitely not the easiest transfer method, but some people swear by it and it totally works for them. But again, it only works with light colored kind of see-through fabric. And our other question here Is good Vancouver area independent stores to source materials? Great question. And I will include these in our follow-up email, but some stores that you can go to, Dresso, definitely. Dresso downtown, it's huge and it is best for fabric. They have tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of fabric. They do also sell some notions. So of course they have scissors. They definitely have needles. They aren't going to be your best source for hoops or floss though. They do sell them. They don't have a very big selection of floss and their hoops are wood. I personally prefer bamboo hoops, which I buy at Michael's. I find with the wood hoops, they tend to splinter and I'm usually sanding them down. But definitely Dresso is essential for fabric. Yes, thank you, Andrew. Andrew has gone in the chat and put the spelling of Dresso. I like going to Michael's for my hoops and my floss. They have a good amount of hoops. They sell bamboo ones, which I prefer. And they also have recently started selling the flexi hoops with the, if you've ever seen that like faux wood print, they have those. And they've also in the last few months started selling fabric, not a whole lot, but it's good for kind of cute prints. And another local store that I recommend is called Spool of Thread. It's on Fraser Street, just kind of past like the Mount Pleasant area. And they have fabric there. It's very cutesy fabric, so lots of very cute prints. They also sell, I don't remember, I haven't been there in a long time, so I don't remember if they sell floss or hoops, but they definitely sell needles and scissors, and they also occasionally sell patterns in little packages. So all of those I will include in our follow-up email, but those are 3 storefronts locally in Vancouver that I recommend. And it looks like that's all. Oh, we've got another one, a plastic hoop. So I bought a plastic hoop. Have you ever used those? Yes. When I was first starting out, I used plastic hoops. They're just as good. I don't tend to use them for display, but they come in really cute colors. When they're in that plastic, they can come in really cute colors, and they, they work just like the wood ones with the inner and outer hoop and the screw hardware on top. So I don't use those very often, but I have used them before and they work great. Do you take, oh, we're getting lots of questions now. Do you take the fabric off the hoop in between stitching sessions? Typically, no, but that's just how I work. Typically, I will leave it in the hoop unless I need to take it out to, to like completely change something on it, or I want to maybe add something in, but typically I keep it in the hoop. Do you have any online resources, spaces, communities that you recommend for exploring embroidery more? Yes. So in my follow-up email, there are so many online resources that I have for you. There's a really good website in there called Urban Threads, and it is my go-to for finding ready-made patterns. There are lots of stitchers on Instagram that kind of have like little communities going. There's a Instagram, or it's also an Instagram account, but it's also a blog that I follow along called So Queer. That's SEWQUEER. And it's a online community of all types of sewers, you know, whether it be like hand embroidery or using the machine. And it's a good place to, you know, ask other stitchers questions about how they do things, or you know, that kind of stuff. So I will definitely include some of those in my follow-up email. Any good places for used notions and materials? Value Village. Not always, but sometimes you can find like really old metal hoops or like a bag of loose floss. Definitely have found a bunch of stuff there sometimes, but definitely check out thrift stores. And, you know, we live in, you know, here in Vancouver, we are very lucky to have such a huge art scene. Some places sometimes will do used art supply drives for people. And so you can always, yeah, just Google like used art, used supplies. And there's usually something going around in the community where you can get something like that. You're not always guaranteed to get like embroidery supplies, but never hurts. Another question here. I have lots of Aida fabric. So Aida fabric is very loose woven fabric that is used specifically for cross stitch most of the time. Can you use Aida for more freestyle designs? Absolutely. So again, if you can get a needle through it, you can embroider it. So the thing with Aida fabric is because it's woven, loosely woven, it's not the easiest thing to get a pattern drawn on. So if you are wanting to use Aida fabric for embroidery, I would definitely recommend getting yourself some of that self-adhesive sticky solvy so that you can draw on and just slap it on top so that you don't have to draw on and potentially have the design a little warped, so to say. I've used muslin fabric before, which is kind of similar in like bumpy, looser woven. And yeah, it's almost impossible to draw on a pattern nicely, but definitely you can use it. Do you have a recommended way to clean or remove smells from vintage supplies, floss, and fabric, or resource for advice? Yes. Yes. So I've had discussions with people before, particularly about getting the smell of tobacco, pardon me, out of fabric. And one product that I have found that really works is called OxyClean. And it's, at least for me, has proven to be very useful in getting stenches out. So I would definitely recommend OxyClean, or if you are a person who can handle smells like eucalyptus or tea tree oil, I would recommend getting some cleaners that have those in them. I'm personally allergic and can't use those, but I have heard from other people that those have also been helpful in the past for getting stenches out of vintage fabric. And another question here, any tips on threading the needle other than using the biggest eye? Yes, and this is a really great question. And I'm actually going to turn my camera back on to show you this. There are two ways, where's my thing? There's my thing. Okay, so there are two ways that I know of using a small slip of paper that you can do. So, got some paper here. So these are my speaking notes. So I'm just going to, and this is very bad. You should only use your floss scissors for floss, but I'm going to be bad and use it on some paper. But so I'm going to cut a little strip of paper here, and let's get some floss and my needle. Uh-oh. Don't ever want to lose a needle. Okay, we'll just use one of these. So I'll just get this. Come on. Oof. Okay, so I've got a needle here, and I've got my floss, and I've got this little tiny piece of paper. So one way that you can use this little piece of paper is to fold it hot dog style, so long ways, so that you've got kind of like a little canoe, and you can get your floss in the canoe. Come on. And then, oops, kind of tuck your little paper canoe through the eye, and boom, threaded needle. So in that same vein, with another little thinner piece of paper, you can fold that in half, and trying to do this so you can see it on the camera. You can put your floss in like that, and then again tuck. Come on. Tuck it in through the needle or the eye, and boom, threaded needle. Yeah, so if you don't want to get a needle threader and you don't want to use, you know, the biggest eye, get a little paper canoe, and you're doing great. Okay, so let me pull up. Oh, looks like I don't have any more. Okay, just gonna take. Okay, and so with that, we will end our questions there, and we are going to do our quick draw. So I've got a little piece of paper here with everybody's name in it, and I'll just take a name out. So who do I have here? I have Hugo. So Hugo, you've won our book. I have your email, and I will get in touch with you about getting you your book. With that, I want to say thank you so much for joining us online today. Before we let you go, I'd like to highlight a few other upcoming programs that we have at the library that you might find interesting. So coming up on November 20th from 3 to 4 p.m., we have Podcasting Climate Change, and that's with our friends in the Inspiration Lab, and they will be talking about, you know, podcasting and the heavy topic of climate change and how podcasting can, you know, inspire us and help us through this time. On November 23rd, we have another session of our Library Stitch Up program. So Library Stitch Up is a really casual, low-key space that you can come into and just do your craft. And you can chat with other crafters and you know, help each other out, ask questions, see what other people are working on. At this particular upcoming session, I will be a guest, and I will be talking about selling embroidery in particular, and what it's like to be at a market. So if you've ever been interested about attending a craft market as a vendor or selling what you make online, I'll be there to chat all about that. And lastly, I would like to let you know about another craft program that I will be running. On November 30th, I will be doing Craft Connections, and we will be talking about the websites Ravelry and Textilia. So Ravelry is a website for knitting and crochet, and Textilia is a Vancouver owned and operated website on machine sewing and garment making. So be sure to take a look at the links for that, and hopefully we'll see you again. I hope this workshop was helpful and that anyone who is looking to start embroidery feels a bit more confident in how to get started. A follow-up email will be sent out in the next day or two with book suggestions, a list of places to find resources, and other good stuff. We will once again pop a link into the chat for our feedback form. It's just a couple of quick questions, and we always appreciate the feedback. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a lovely rest of your evening.